No intro, let's dive right in. Do you know who the journalist Irene was inspired by? It's this journalist, Gary Webb, who put the CIA on the spot for destroying African American communities. The 20,000-word article enraged black communities, prompted congressional hearings, and became one of the first major national security stories in history to blow up online. It also sparked an aggressive backlash from the nation's most powerful media outlets, which devoted considerable resources to discredit author Gary Webb's reporting. Their efforts succeeded, costing Webb his career. On December 10, 2004, the journalist was found dead in his apartment, having ended his 8-year downfall with two .38 caliber bullets to the head. His death was ruled a suicide. What are the odds that someone can shoot? Never mind. Gary Webb was born August 31st, 1955 in Corona, California. His father was a Marine sergeant, and his family moved frequently as his father's career took him to new assignments, but they eventually settled in Indianapolis when his dad retired. After high school, Webb attended an Indianapolis community college on a scholarship, where he first began writing. After transferring to Northern Kentucky, he entered their journalism program and wrote for the school paper, The Northerner. Although he attended Northern Kentucky for 4 years, he did not finish his degree. Instead, he found work in 1978 as a reporter at the Kentucky Post, a local paper affiliated with the larger Cincinnati Post. In 1979, Webb married Susan Bell. The couple eventually had 3 children. The United States backed the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua until it came to an end with the Sandinista Revolution of 1978 and 1979. With no legal recourse to topple the 5-person junta that took Somoza's place, CIA interests had to find alternative means to plant a figurehead of their choosing. Now, President Ronald Reagan allocated $19 million to set up a U.S.-trained paramilitary force of 500 Nicaraguans and eventually became known as the Nicaraguan Democratic Force. But in order to topple the Sandinistas, the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, also known as the Contras, needed a lot more weapons and a lot more money. And to get that money, they needed to look beyond foreign aid. Soon enough, according to Webb, the Contras set its sights on the poor black neighborhoods of South Central Los Angeles and rendered it ground zero of the 1980s crack epidemic.
Investigative reporting is being sort of squeezed out of the picture, and I think intentionally, because it tends to ruffle feathers. I mean, good investigative reporting does ruffle feathers.
Gary's troubles began in August 1996 when his employer, the San Jose Mercury News, published a groundbreaking 3-part investigation he had worked on for more than a year. Carrying the full title, Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion, the articles reported that in addition to waging a proxy war for the U.S. government against Nicaragua's government, elements of the CIA-backed Contra rebels were also involved in trafficking cocaine to the U.S. in order to fund their counter-revolutionary campaign.
This all happened in Los Angeles County within the past 36 hours. Murderous gang crime, fueled by the traffic in rock cocaine. From those same gangs, crack now flows northward to the Bay Area in enormous quantities.
The secret flow of drugs and money, Webb reported, had a direct link to the subsequent explosion of crack cocaine abuse that had devastated California's most vulnerable African American neighborhoods. Dark Alliance focused on the lives of 3 men involved in shipping cocaine to the U.S. Ricky Freeway Ross, a legendary LA drug dealer, Oscar Danilo Blandon Reyes, considered by the U.S. government to be Nicaragua's biggest cocaine dealer living in the United States, and Meneses Cantero, a powerful Nicaraguan player who had allegedly recruited Blandon to sell drugs in support of the counter-revolution. The articles examined the relationship between the men, their impact on the drug market in California and elsewhere, and the disproportionate sentencing of African Americans under the crack cocaine laws. Side note, the disproportionate sentencing of African Americans versus other ethnicities was never disputed during the heavily funded campaigns to discredit Gary's articles. I wonder why, but more on that later. Okay, so more than a decade before WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, Webb showcased the power and reach of online journalism. Pause. I think when a man or woman can sway the public's opinion without using the mainstream media to do it, they become threats to the powers that be. If they can't control you, what do you think the next step is going to be? What do you guys think about that? An article released in 2014 from the CIA's in-house journal included a previously unreleased 6-page article titled "Managing a Nightmare: CIA Public Affairs and the Drug Conspiracy Story." In this article, a CIA Directorate of Intelligence staffer named Nicholas Dujmovic described shutting the story down as easy once it became mainstream due to a ground base of already productive relations with journalists. The CIA watched with relief as the largest newspapers in the country rescued the agency from disaster, and in the process, destroyed the reputation of an aggressive, award-winning reporter, Gary Webb. Do you guys understand how easy it is for us to be manipulated by the media? All I'm saying is take what you hear in the media with a grain of salt, because he who controls the media also controls the opinions of the public. That's the real power that often gets overlooked. Anyway, Dujmovic also pointed out that much of what was reported in Dark Alliance was not new information. Indeed, in 1985, more than a decade before the series was even published, Associated Press journalists Robert Perry and Brian Barger found that Contra groups had engaged in cocaine trafficking, in part to help finance their war against Nicaragua. Alright, so check this out. In a move that foreshadowed Gary Webb's experience, the Reagan White House launched a concerted behind-the-scenes campaign to besmirch the professionalism of Perry and Barger and to discredit all reporting on the Contras and drugs. If that isn't history repeating itself, I don't know what is. Nevertheless, a special Senate subcommittee chaired by then-Senator John Kerry investigated the Associated Press's findings, and in 1989 released a 1,166-page report on the covert U.S. operations throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. The report found considerable evidence that the Contras were linked to running drugs and guns, and that the U.S. government knew about it. Now, if the government knew about it, wouldn't that mean the same White House that discredited reports in 1985 also knew about it? I digress. Now, remember that part I mentioned earlier about the CIA having, and I quote, great productive relations with the media? Well, here's another example. Despite such damning assessments, John Kerry's subcommittee report received scant attention from the country's major newspapers. Seven years later, Gary would be the one to pick up the story. His articles distinguished themselves from the Associated Press reports in part by connecting an issue that seemed distant to many U.S. readers, drug trafficking in Central America, to a deeply felt domestic story, the impact of crack cocaine in California's urban African American communities. Three of America's leading newspapers, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post, followed up with reports questioning Webb's conclusions. His boss, Jerome Sipos, wrote to all three papers defending Gary's articles, but ultimately lost the uphill battle and decided to go against Gary and point out that his articles did not meet company standards and fell short of being accurate. The San Jose Mercury News came under considerable pressure for publishing these stories, and in 1997, Gary decided to resign from the newspaper. He published Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion a year later. In interviews after leaving the Mercury News, Gary described the 1997 controversy as media manipulation. Gary is quoted saying, "The government side of the story is coming through the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They use the giant corporate press rather than saying anything directly. If you work through friendly reporters on major newspapers, it comes off as the New York Times saying it and not a mouthpiece of the CIA." Gary reflected on his fall from grace in the 2002 book, Into the Buzzsaw, And the link's in the description for that if you guys want to pick it up off Amazon. Prior to Dark Alliance, Webb said, "I was winning awards, getting raises, lecturing college classes, appearing on TV shows, and judging journalism contests. And then I wrote some stories that made me realize how sadly misplaced my bliss had been. The reason I'd enjoyed such smooth sailing for so long hadn't been as I'd assumed because I was careful and diligent and good at my job. The truth was that in all those years, I hadn't written anything important enough to suppress." Thanks everyone, I appreciate you being here. They made a movie about this guy called Kill the Messenger. I put a link to the trailer in the description and a link to the Dark Alliance book if you want to pick that up off Amazon.